Thank you, Tony. Everyone, give him a warm round of applause, because that's a lot of information to go through. Yeah. He has been instrumental in helping us implement these Lunch and Learn programs, so I always appreciate his help. So what month is it? Anyone? What monthly health observance do we have in March? Nutrition Month. So we figured this was a quite appropriate topic for Nutrition Month, considering that there's a lot of controversy on gluten-free diets and whether we should or shouldn't adhere to those. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ashlea Braun. She's earned her bachelor's degree in medical dietetics here at Ohio State in 2011. Since then, Ashlea has worked in inpatient and outpatient practice areas and is currently an outpatient dietitian here at the Wexner Medical Center, where she sees patients as part of the cardiac rehabilitation program. Ashlea is also a clinical research assistant and dual MS PhD student in the School for Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, where she is part of a research team conducting lifestyle interventions in cancer survivors. Everyone, please give Ashlea a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. So we got to fix something real quick. Okay. Let's test it. There we go. So again, I'm Ashlea Braun, and this is my presentation, Gluten-Free Diets, the Good, the Bad, and the Fad. So you already heard that. We'll skip over that. Oh, a little side note. I work for the wonderful Colleen Spies, so if anybody knows her, props. I have to give it. Okay, so what are the objectives of this presentation? Well, as a result of watching this presentation, I want you to be able to identify what gluten is, where it can be found, when it should be avoided, and I also want you to take away what a general healthy diet should look like, right? So I think that's where some of this confusion comes from, is the average person wants to know, should I be avoiding gluten? So I really want you to come away with understanding whether or not you should actually do that. So why did I want to have this talk? Well, I saw this come out. Gluten-free diets may be tied to an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And I said, well, we just really have to talk about this, because this is going to confuse people. Is it the next egg, right? Diet recommendations are always changing. First, you're supposed to eat low fat, and then just kidding, that's wrong. Now you can eat a little bit of fat, and you don't want to eat too many carbohydrates, but then there's also wheat in the mix. What's the deal with wheat? Is it because it's a carbohydrate? Is there something unique with wheat? And then what's about gluten? Is gluten wheat? What's going on? And I pulled this from Pinterest, the ever popular Pinterest, right? So we have an egg baked into an avocado that is paleo and gluten-free. Confusing information. What's the deal? So I want to be clear about some things. I don't know if anybody has ever seen that Jimmy Kimmel skit where he asks people what gluten is. Has anybody seen that before, right? And nobody really knows what it is? Well, gluten is not a carbohydrate, okay? I think a lot of people find that confusing. It's not a carbohydrate. It's actually a complex of proteins, particularly two, known as gliadin and glutenin. And so where is gluten? A lot of people always think of bread, right? So bread, pasta, crackers, cake, all that stuff. But it's in a slew of other things, beer, soy sauce, the list goes on and on. If you get chicken at a restaurant and there's seasoning on top of it, there's good chance there's gluten in that seasoning. It's a really extensive list, and this is not comprehensive. I'm going to interrupt myself real quick, and I meant to tell you guys that you can ask me any questions along the way, okay? If anybody has a question, just interrupt me. So I want to start off with, are they good? What is the evidence to show that gluten-free diets are beneficial? Well, of course, they are for people with celiac disease. And celiac disease is similar. It might be different, might be related to two things known as gluten ataxia and dermatitis herpetiformis, which are basically alterations in gait and a rash on the skin that may happen as a result of gluten ingestion, and they may be seen in individuals with celiac disease. And of course, celiac disease is triggered by the consumption of gluten. However, it has genetic and environmental causes, and it is not caused nor is it cured by eating or eliminating gluten, okay? So if somebody has celiac disease and they stop eating gluten, they don't have any more symptoms, but they still have celiac disease, okay? And then I have wheat allergies on here with a little bit of an asterisk, because wheat allergies are not celiac disease, And in fact, wheat allergies don't really have much to do with gluten at all. It has to do with wheat protein, okay? And then there's also this point that it's allergic versus autoimmune reaction. So celiac disease is an autoimmune response. You ingest gluten, and you have an autoimmune response in your gastrointestinal tract that manifests as a variety of things, from skin rashes to constipation to diarrhea to bloating to severe things like osteoporosis or infertility. So it's no light condition, okay? It's a pretty big deal. And these individuals, yes, they should absolutely avoid gluten. What about this? Okay, this is where things start to get really confusing. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity, okay? I'm just going to say from the get-go, nobody agrees on this. The literature is wildly inconsistent, okay? But what some of the literature is suggesting that if there is a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, it is more of an immune response, not an autoimmune response, right? So autoimmunity means you're essentially attacking your own cells. It is instead an immune response, so it's triggering your immune system to attack something, and that something is gluten. The symptoms are also all over the place. They can be gastrointestinal and they can be extraintestinal. Some people say they have joint pain or headaches because they consume gluten. But it's very subjective, and there's no conclusive definition or no conclusive set of criteria. The research is all over the place. But some do feel that this is a unique situation where an individual should consume gluten. And I have a little bit more about that at the end. So what do they say, right? They say that gluten does this. They say that I shouldn't eat gluten for this reason. So I got on Google, our best friend Google, and I typed something along the lines of, why is gluten bad? Or why should I eat gluten? And what did I find? Well, paleoleap.com and, glutenfreechicks.com told me that gluten-free diets can help with weight loss, neurological disorders, inflammation, autoimmune disorders, leaky gut syndrome, and I put in here the paleo diet because when you start to talk about gluten like this, you start to get into these weird areas about the paleo diet, which is different than a gluten-free diet. But sometimes the philosophies behind them on things like paleoleap.com start to sort of intertwine. So I put that on here. What's going on here? Well, there's way too much. So there's interesting information like autoimmune disorder. So again, celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder. And if you have one autoimmune disorder, you automatically have a higher risk of another autoimmune disorder. So if there's type 1 diabetes in your family, you do have a greater risk of something like celiac disease because they are both autoimmune disorders. Not to say that gluten causes autoimmune disorders, but somebody might want to consider avoiding them, or they might feel they need to consider avoiding them if they have autoimmune disorders in their family. There's things in the literature that show, that look into issues like a leaky gut syndrome. Some individuals do have leaky gut syndrome. It's not that it's caused by gluten, but they become concerned about gluten if they have a leaky gut syndrome, which is caused by other things. So the point is the literature is all over the place, and what's happening is a little bit of cherry picking. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that terminology, but it means you kind of go into the literature and you pick a few things that sound really great, and then you talk about them. So if you go to one of these websites, they're going to give you a big, long description about how gluten is the enemy, and then they cite one study. That's not sufficient, okay? Because you could get on there and look at another study that shows that gluten doesn't do any of these things. So you have to look at the comprehensive literature, okay? And that's not what these websites are doing. So there's also other factors. I'm sure you guys have heard of things like, people are concerned about red meat now. They're talking about the microbiome, so that's the bacteria that's in your gut, and they all interact together. So when you eat gluten, there's not just little particles of gluten floating in your gastrointestinal tract in isolation. There's a lot of other things in there, and they're all interacting together. And so you can't just say that gluten is the problem or gluten is causing these things because it's a complicated interaction, okay? So there's research to say that, things can happen when you eat gluten, but there's also research to say that nothing happens when you eat gluten. And so we don't know enough yet to give any conclusive recommendations, okay? These guys, these books. Anybody read these? Few hands. I tried. They made me kind of angry, so I stopped. And we're going to talk about those because I think this has really fed into a lot of people's concerns, right? These are doctors writing these books. They sound like they know what they're talking about. They have figures inside of the books. What's really going on here? Well, this guy, Dr. David Perlmutter. It's worth noting that he used to have a supplement company. That is a pretty big red flag from the get-go. He was selling like elderly longevity supplement packages, okay? Red flag. Anyway, so this book, it's called Grain Brain, and there's a picture of bread on it, but he's kind of attacking carbohydrates as a whole. And remember, gluten is not a carbohydrate, and grain is certainly not the only carbohydrate. There's carbohydrates in milk, there's carbohydrates in fruit, there's carbohydrates in vegetables, there's carbohydrates in just about everything. And if we are talking about just grains, I looked up a recent systematic review in a journal called BMJ right here at the bottom from 2016, so recent, that showed that grain consumption, all grain consumption, including wheat, decreased the risk for heart disease, cancer, all-cause mortality, and mortality from several other conditions, okay? So it's pretty important to eat grains, okay? And like I mentioned, grains and carbohydrates, gluten and carbohydrates, completely different things. This author starts to get into more of an issue with the ketogenic diet. I'm sure people have heard about that. That's another talk on another day. But what I will say is that if you truly want to follow a ketogenic diet, you have to consume about 20 grams of carbohydrates. That's less than a slice of bread, okay? So very, 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 very different stuff going on here. And not all carbs are created equal. So these are not the same, right? They both contain gluten. They both have carbohydrates, but one responds very differently inside of your body than the other. So then this guy, Wheat Belly, he focuses a little bit more on wheat itself. He does kind of talk about the whole ketogenic diet thing. So if anybody isn't familiar, the ketogenic diet was started for children with refractory epilepsy, which means they can't respond to conventional medical treatment. So they're put on a diet that limits their carbohydrates to something as low as 4 grams a day. And so this doctor, one of the first things he says in the book is that children who eliminate wheat from their diet stop having seizures. Oh, that's not true. You can't eat an apple on a ketogenic diet and not go back into a state where you're having seizures. So here we have a perfect example of doctors sort of cherry-picking the information and a little bit of smoke and mirrors to just sort of take a few bits of information and say, well, this sounds really exciting because of X, Y, and Z. So be careful if you decide to read this book. And not all wheat is created equal. So Wheat Belly, he's implying that you're going to gain weight if you eat wheat. Well, if you eat a bunch of white bread, you probably will. And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. But if you eat some of these things, probably not, okay? And so he's really distorting the information. I want you to be careful with taking this advice and stick with the dietary guidelines, which we will talk about, and go for a variety of grains. So if you are worried about eating too much wheat, then there's things other than wheat, okay? There's other grains besides that, like rice. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Oh, so speaking of which, so I talked about the white bread and the wheat bread and the whole grains. This is straight from the USDA 2015 dietary guidelines. And as you can see here, this blue bar is what we're supposed to be doing, okay? These orange dots are refined grains. So that's things like white bread, crackers, tortillas, cupcakes, those sorts of things. And down here is the whole grains. So what's really happening here? What should we be doing? Should we be avoiding these sources, or should we just be eating something better? And this has nothing to do with gluten. These whole grains, a lot of them are going to have gluten, but that's okay, okay? Oh, and I found this. This is from Wheat Belly. It just cracks me up. Found this on Google Images. Aside from some extra fiber, eating 2 slices of whole wheat bread is really little different and often worse than drinking a can of sugar-sweetened soda or eating, what is that, a Snickers bar. Okay, so wait a second. Aside from some extra fiber, well, that's kind of a big deal. And how about the sugar? So if anybody really wants to know the details, in the book, he's referring to the glycemic index and the glycemic load, which refers to how quickly a food releases carbohydrates into your blood sugar. And bread does have a little bit of a higher glycemic index and glycemic load, but guess what doesn't? This sort of stuff. So if that concerns you, switch from some of the whole wheat breads to some of the whole kernel grains is what I like to call them, like oats or quinoa. And this doesn't become such a problem. And I want to talk more about fiber, okay? Oh, well, I will. So gluten-free diets, what's the bad? So I go back to, why I started this. Gluten-free diets, do they increase the risk for diabetes? Well, not all gluten-free foods are created equal, okay? Yeah, these foods are gluten-free, but you probably shouldn't be eating them, okay? Unless you have celiac disease or another condition that warrants eliminating gluten from your diet. These also don't have gluten, but these sure don't taste as good as chocolate chip cookies. So which one are we going for? Okay, we have to be realistic. So this is bread, classic. If you do want to eat bread, and you think, well, I'll go gluten-free because it's better for me, let's look at some things. Back to the fiber issue. Fiber is extraordinarily important for your health, okay? And we don't usually eat enough of it. This on the left is gluten-free bread, Udi's whole grain gluten-free bread. Little label reading 101. So a serving size is 2 slices. So if you eat 2 slices of bread, you get 2 grams of fiber. That's not very good. Okay, I'm going to quiz you. Well, I'll ask you now. Does anybody want to tell me how much fiber you need in a day? Somebody, sorry, there are dietitians in the room, so I hope that you know. Anybody want to say it? Or anybody besides the dietitians? 25 grams. Women need 25 grams. Men need 30 to 35 grams. So in the context of your day, by the way, meat and animal products don't have any fiber. So if you're eating bread and you're not eating a whole lot of other whole grains or fruits and vegetables, this is not going to cut it for anybody. Over here, we have my personal favorite, and I have no conflicts of interest. Sesame seed Ezekiel bread. It is not gluten-free. And 1 slice has 3 grams of fiber. So 2 slices of bread will give you 6 grams as opposed to 2. See the difference? And let's see here. What about the calories? Well, no, it technically has fewer calories, but that's okay. Let's see, what else do we have? Protein. Well, really, the fiber is the main one. And I want you guys to take that away. I have a few more examples on here. Oh, pasta. Okay, so this is the gluten-free pasta. It has 1 gram of fiber. These are all the same serving size, 2 ounces. So 2 ounces of gluten-free pasta has 200 calories. This is whole grain, gluten-rich pasta, okay? And it has 180 calories, so fewer calories, same portion size, and it has 6 grams of fiber. A lot more fiber. This is plain white gluten-rich pasta. What does it have? It has the same calories, but it still has more fiber than the gluten-free variety, okay? So what I want you to take away from this, do we have another one? No, that's it. The gluten-free alternative is not healthier for you unless you have a condition that warrants cutting it out, like celiac disease. For the average individual, this is probably going to be the worst option, okay? So this, the research, there is indeed research that shows there might be a relationship between type 2 diabetes and gluten consumption. And it's not a published study, but it was presented at an American Heart Association lifestyle conference. And you can find the abstract online, which I pulled. And it does suggest that there is an inverse relationship between the incidence of type 2 diabetes and gluten consumption. And what that means is they found that people who consumed more gluten got less type 2 diabetes, and the other way around. The less gluten they ate, the more type 2 diabetes they got. Yes? I'm not sure about the diagnosis, but they did adjust for several factors. And I would think, it was incidence. So they received a diagnosis of diabetes over the course of the study, but they did control for other factors like age and gender, and I believe BMI as well. Any other questions? So what does this come down to? Well, nobody really knows. The authors did not provide any speculation as to what caused it in their abstract, but if you read, a lot of it has to do with, anybody got a guess? Fiber, because you're not getting enough fiber, okay? So we already talked about how much fiber you need. So if you're not going to eat gluten and you're not going to eat whole grains, where do you get your fiber? We get them from fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and grains, okay? And there are grains that do not contain gluten. They are things like corn, quinoa, buckwheat, teff, millet, amaranth, rice, and more. A lot of us don't eat too much of this, and if we eat things like rice, there's sometimes white rice, which doesn't really have any fiber in it, okay? And then there are other gluten-containing grains like farro, barley, and rye. But two of the major contributors outside of these are going to be fruits and vegetables. But guess what? We don't eat enough of those either. So this is also from the dietary guidelines. The blue is what we need, and the orange is what we do. Nobody gets enough, okay? So if we're not eating whole grains, and we're not eating vegetables, and we're not eating fruits, we are not getting enough fiber, okay? So if you do decide to cut out gluten, that is a major, major, major concern. So what about the fad? Is the gluten-free diet a fad? Well, my opinion is, for the most part, yes. not for people who have celiac disease or related diagnoses where they are told you need to cut out gluten. Not for those individuals, but otherwise, gluten-free does not equate to healthy, okay? A cookie's a cookie's a cookie, no matter how you cut it, okay? And look at this, 2 cookies, gluten-free, they still have calories, they still have fat, they still have sugar, they have 2 grams of fiber, but you can't really write home about that. So what sort of evidence do we have? Well, if you are concerned about celiac disease, less than 1% of the population actually has celiac disease. Interestingly enough, though, more than that follows a gluten-free diet, whether or not they actually need to, though. And this is really important. So if you feel like you might need to follow a gluten-free diet, if you're experiencing something like constipation, gas, bloating, joint pain, headaches, see a doctor, okay? Because those are really nonspecific symptoms. A headache could mean a lot of things. Not to mention, if you have constipation or gas, you might not be eating enough fiber, just a thought. But there are a lot of other things, so you need to see a doctor. If you decide to self-diagnose yourself and start following a gluten-free diet, you could be missing something that could become detrimental later. So don't try to just follow it. See your doctor, determine if it's really appropriate. See a dietitian too. But that is ultimately what you should be doing. So what are the concerns? If you say, Ashlea, you know what? I don't have celiac disease. I don't feel like seeing a doctor. I just want to cut out gluten. Okay, well, you need to be careful because they do have less fiber, and you do need 25 to 30 grams. That's related to heart health, cancer prevention, a slew of other things. So you do need fiber. Many people are reliant on wheat products for their nutrients. Think of folic acid fortification in whole grain in grain products. We didn't eat enough folic acid, so the government started putting it in grains because we don't eat it in vegetables. So if you all of a sudden don't really start eating more vegetables and you decide to go gluten-free, you're probably not cutting it on these nutrients. And they're also fortified with B vitamins and iron. And gluten-free products are sort of ultra-refined because they have to be refined excessively to get out all the gluten. Because if you have celiac disease, I've seen people who can't even bake cookies with flour because if they inhale it, it'll initiate a reaction. So these people really have to stay away from it. And so the products are ultra-refined and they really don't have the nutrients that you need. So be careful. And remember that if you're going to go around saying that you're on a gluten-free diet, you need to be careful because you better not be drinking beer, you better not be using soy sauce, you better be checking all the seasoning that you're using because all of that can contain gluten. Now, if you do decide, well, maybe I just shouldn't eat so much bread and so much pasta, that might be a great idea. You don't have to go gluten-free, you don't have to go grain-free, switch to quinoa, switch to farro, it's my personal favorite, but it does actually contain gluten. Whole wheat products, any of those things, okay? And you will still render a benefit. Ultimately, it comes down to the refined carbohydrates. So fewer refined carbohydrates, increase your consumption of whole grains, and you will render a benefit without forcing yourself to go gluten-free. So, yes?
So the arbitrary statement of feeling better.
Yes.
I have 2 friends that say they can think more clearly, they feel like they're losing weight. Is that, you haven't really listed that as a symptom of a gluten problem. Is that really, you think that's anywhere tied?
It's too hard to tell. A lot of it could just be placebo effect. A lot of it could be, well, what are you eating instead of gluten-free products? And so if somebody does cut out gluten, to whatever extent that might be, and they're eating more fruits and vegetables have things besides fiber that you need, like vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, the list goes on. So you might just be eating things that you weren't getting otherwise. So that could make you feel better, and it's too subjective. You know, it's how do you measure something like that? I feel better. Okay. You know, that's just too subjective. And if they do feel good and they're doing it in a smart manner and they're getting everything else that they need, you know, it's okay, I suppose, but it's probably not worth the attention to detail that would be required to actually follow a gluten-free diet. So ultimately, it's just too subjective. And like I said, sometimes it comes down to not only are you maybe eating things that are better for you, but you're paying attention a little bit more to the foods that you are picking. So, hey, I can't eat gluten. What else am I actually going to get at the grocery store? So you're thinking things through a little bit more. So there's a lot of factors at play. Whether or not it's the absence of gluten is actually clearing up their thought processes, I don't think there's anything to support that that's actually the case. Yes?
Are there particular vegetables or fruit that are higher in fiber than others?
There are. I wouldn't worry too much about that if you're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. I tell people to just start with what they like. If you like bananas, bananas get a real bad rap. Just eat them, okay? It's a fruit. But, eat other vegetables. Eat whatever vegetable you like. If you like spinach, eat spinach. If you don't, eat something else. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty, broccoli has a lot more fiber than some vegetables. Berries, especially raspberries and blackberries, they have a lot of fiber. But ultimately, just try to pick foods that you enjoy. And if you meet the recommendations of the fruits and vegetables that you enjoy, you should then be meeting your fiber recommendations as well. Any other questions? Oh, this is my little, you guys probably caught on to this, but yes, most Americans probably should eat less gluten, and they probably should eat primarily foods that do not contain gluten. What are those? Well, I already showed you. They're fruits and vegetables, okay? And you might think of these as a plant-based, primarily plant-based, or Mediterranean-style dietary pattern. I know you guys have heard of those. There is a wealth of evidence supporting the benefits of eating these types of things. It's not a diet. It's just in general you're eating certain types of things, which can include grains, gluten-containing and otherwise, as well as bread, okay? Here's a little image. There's a lot of foods that don't contain gluten that we're supposed to be eating. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains. And over here, our little friend salmon, also very good for you. No gluten, as long as you're not seasoning it with gluten-containing seasoning. So yes, you should be eating mostly these foods, so therefore you would automatically be decreasing your gluten consumption, but the idea of complete elimination of gluten is probably not worth the effort and might not actually get you anything. I gotta show it, I know. I feel like people are probably thinking this is very obvious, very stereotypical for a dietitian to show, but what do we have here? Half of your food should be fruits and vegetables, right? Only a fourth of it should be grains, which is really where the gluten comes in. So if you're eating the other stuff that you're supposed to, you're probably not going to be eating that much gluten anyway, okay? So ultimately, just worry about increasing your dietary pattern, more fruits and vegetables. Gluten's not worth the stress. If you have a symptom that you're concerned about, see your doctor. If you think you have celiac disease, there are blood tests and biopsies. It's not just a shot in the dark. See your doctor, okay? And that's it. Any questions? Yes. Yes. It should be. Now, if you're using just real spices like garlic or cayenne pepper or basil, those shouldn't have it in it. It's more of like your, mixed seasonings or some of the salt-free mixed seasonings when they're starting to mix a bunch of stuff together. That's really where you have to look, and it should be in there. That's the problem is people who really have to watch their gluten, like you have to read everything. So yeah, so if you do want to avoid gluten, modified food starch can sometimes be a gluten-containing ingredient. Again, it takes a lot of attention to detail. Yes? It's just malt vinegar, because malt contains gluten, so malt vinegar has gluten in it. But like red wine vinegar, I don't believe should have any gluten in it.
Hey folks, could I get your responses on the microphones? Tony and I are going to be going around. We have a few people that are tuning in that may want to hear what the question is.
I should have thought of that.
We have additional questions?
So it seems like you had a specific set of things that we do not eat enough of that might be sort of taking the place of a gluten-free diet, like fiber and fruits and vegetables in general. Can you summarize those again? What do you think? What are the non-fad things that we should be focusing on?
So you should definitely focus on your whole grains. So that's, the more whole kernel grains, the better. So that oats, brown rice, quinoa. And I can give you, I don't have the recommendation memorized off the top of my head. Any dietitians know how many whole grains you're supposed to have? Oh, it probably says on there. Fruits and vegetables, it's 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. So you can remember that. So it's cup ounce equivalences. So down here you can see ages. So if you're male, age 14 to 18, you need 3 to 5 cup equivalents, or ounce equivalents, I'm sorry, of whole grains per day. There is a lot of information. If you go to choosemyplate.gov, they have all of it broken down on there. You need to work towards your recommendation for whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. That's usually where Americans are falling short. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Any other questions? Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you very much,
There's another
Ashley.
question. I know the Whole Grains Council has a website, and I believe they have some recipes on there. I don't know of any specific resource. I do utilize Google for recipes, so if you just searched whole grain recipes, you would likely be able to find some. You can try. You can also try millionhearts.hhs.gov. They have a lot of heart-healthy recipes on there, and they have some whole grain recipes as well. Any other questions? Thanks, guys.
Thank you.